They laughed when Wall Street's coldest billionaire vanished from the boardroom, but they didn't see him standing in the snow, barefoot, beside a woman who once cursed at a parking meter and a boy who spoke in colors. They didn't see the room built from silence, where children who were told they were broken learned to sing without words. This isn't a story about wealth or power. It's about listening so deeply that the whole world changes, and it all started with a single whispered "again." The first time Nathan Caldwell saw her, she was cursing at a parking meter. Not loudly, not with dramatics, just low and sharp under her breath, like a hiss meant for the universe alone. Her son stood behind her, small hands wrapped around the strap of a too large backpack, watching her with the quiet patience of someone used to broken machines and waiting. Nathan had stepped out of his car across the street, already late for a board meeting, already annoyed with his assistant, already bracing for another day of slide decks and empty smiles. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way her shoulders tensed with each failed swipe of her card. Maybe it was the boy, 6, maybe 7, who never whined, never fidgeted. Or maybe it was just that Nathan had spent his life surrounded by people who wore wealth like armor, and this woman, in her second-hand coat and scuffed boots, radiated more dignity than any of them. She finally kicked the meter, not hard, just enough to make herself feel like she hadn't completely surrendered. "Need help?" he asked, before he could think better of it. She turned, eyes narrowing. She was pretty. Not in the curated way women in his circle were, not glossy or precise. Her hair was wind-blown, her lipstick fading, but her eyes, sharp and amber and unflinching, made him stand straighter. "No," she said, but the card trembled slightly in her hand. He reached into his coat and pulled out a quarter. She hesitated, then accepted it with a nod. "I'll pay you back," she added, sliding it into the slot. "I won't hold my breath," he replied. The meter blinked green. She exhaled. The boy looked up at her with something like awe. Nathan turned to go. He had meetings, deadlines, a portfolio worth billions to protect. But before he stepped off the curb, she called out, "I'm Harper. This is Mason." He turned. "Nathan." She smiled, not polite, not flirtatious, just a small curve of the mouth that made something in his chest shift. 3 weeks later, he saw her again. Same street, different meter. This time, she had exact change. "You again," she said, amused. He wanted to say something clever, but all he managed was, "Looks like the machine's learned its lesson." Mason giggled. Nathan didn't walk away this time. They talked. About parking tickets, and the price of coffee, and the way the city always felt 2 degrees colder than the forecast promised. She didn't ask what he did, didn't recognize his name, didn't pretend to care. He found it oddly disarming. He walked them to the library, where Mason had a tutoring session, then returned to his office 10 minutes late and more focused than he'd been in months. By the 5th time he saw her, he brought coffee. By the 10th, he knew her schedule better than his own. They never called them dates, just encounters, shared moments, sidewalks and sandwiches and Mason's art projects. When he finally asked to take her out, properly, with reservations and tablecloths and real glassware, she laughed. "You sure you want to be seen with someone who can't afford valet?" "I'll park it myself," he said. They began slowly. Dinner once a week, then twice. He met Mason officially, was introduced as Mom's friend Nathan, and spent the better part of an afternoon helping build a robot from cereal boxes and duct tape. He found he didn't mind. He stopped taking calls after 6, ignored emails on weekends. His colleagues were stunned. The man once known as the Ghost of Wall Street, flawless, brutal, unshakably efficient, now missed morning meetings and smiled too easily. They whispered, they speculated, they laughed, but he didn't care, because Harper's laugh made him feel human again, because Mason's trust, slow and cautious, was worth more than any investor handshake, because somewhere along the way, Harper had stopped apologizing for her life, and Nathan had started wishing he'd known her when he still had everything and thought it was enough. The night he proposed, it was raining. They were in the small kitchen of her apartment, the one with the uneven tiles and the leaky faucet. Mason was asleep. Harper wore a sweatshirt that had once been white and now lived somewhere between oatmeal and gray. He didn't have a ring, just words. "I don't want to fix your life," he said. "I just want to be part of it." She stared at him for a long time, then nodded. They married 6 weeks later. No church, no orchestra, just a courthouse and 3 witnesses. His lawyers lost their minds. His board demanded explanations. He gave none until the truth came out. They found out the way people always do, sloppily, too late, and with more noise than understanding. It started with a photograph, as it always does. A paparazzo trailing Nathan's car caught them leaving a pediatric neurology center in Brooklyn. Harper was holding Mason's hand. Nathan was holding Harper's. None of them were smiling. That one image made its way into inboxes across the finance world within hours. People made assumptions. They whispered the words like secrets: disabled, sick, struggling. They scoffed at the way Nathan lingered outside the hospital doors, at the way Mason's legs looked stiff in his jeans, at the way Harper's coat had a frayed cuff. The woman he'd married, they decided, was beneath him. They didn't say it out loud, of course, not at first. They framed it as concern. They scheduled meetings, asked questions. Was he well? Was he still fully committed to the firm's long-term strategy? They cited his new distractions, his board seat on 3 Fortune 100 companies, his sudden decision to leave the penthouse and move into a brownstone in a less guarded part of the city. They called it impulsive. They called it foolish. He ignored them. Because every night he returned to Harper's laughter, to the smell of Mason's paint-streaked hands, to the sound of water boiling on the stove, and slowly the life he had once built in skyscrapers began to shrink behind him like a shadow fading in the dark. The truth didn't break until 2 months after their wedding. Nathan had taken a short-term leave, publicly, for health and balance, privately, because Mason had started having seizures again. The boy had always been fragile, born too soon, lungs too tight, brain wired in ways doctors didn't always understand. Harper had explained it the way she explained everything, clearly, with no self-pity. "Sometimes he needs more," she'd said. "Not because he's broken, just because the world wasn't made for how he moves through it." Nathan sat through appointments, held Mason's hand through tests, canceled a keynote in Berlin to be there when Mason tried a new mobility device. He started reading research articles at night, highlighting studies and emailing specialists at 2 a.m. One of those specialists leaked the file, not on purpose. A colleague had accessed it, saw the name Langford on the top, and connected it to the investor whose net worth was listed just under $8 billion at last count. From there, it was inevitable. The news cycle exploded. Wall Street's coldest investor marries single mom with disabled son. What is he hiding? Langford steps away amid family health crisis. Is the empire at risk? Insider reveals truth about Nathan Langford's surprise marriage. They dissected Harper's life in headlines. The barista jobs, the years on and off Medicaid, the degree unfinished when Mason was born. They found her eviction records, her old blog, a poem she wrote at 19 about loneliness. And still, Nathan said nothing. They speculated endlessly. Love story, midlife breakdown, guilt trip. Some said she was a gold digger. Others said she was the long game, a con woman with quiet eyes. Then someone leaked the file. Not the medical one, the other one. The one Harper had never told Nathan about because she didn't think it mattered anymore. She was the founder of a failed startup, not just any startup, a medical diagnostic platform, built for children with rare neuromuscular disorders. Developed years ago when Mason was still an infant, before she realized just how much care he would need. She'd written the code herself, pitched investors, secured angel funding. She'd even been featured in a local tech journal under the headline, "Single Mom Changing Pediatric Medicine from Her Kitchen Table." But she couldn't scale it. She had no team, no capital. And Mason got sick, again and again. And when it came down to a decision between a beta launch and her son's feeding tube being replaced correctly, she chose the one that didn't come with a pitch deck. The company folded. The software disappeared. She never mentioned it again, until someone found it. They recovered the prototype. They tracked the code to a line of research being used in a billion-dollar AI diagnostics company halfway around the world. It was hers. She hadn't patented it, hadn't fought. She'd let it go. Nathan confronted her with the article in his hands, eyes blazing with something between awe and grief. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him the same way she always had, unapologetic, calm. "Because I'm not the story. He is." That night, Nathan released a statement. Not through his lawyers, not through a publicist. He wrote it himself in Harper's tiny kitchen, with Mason asleep in the next room and a single lamp on the table humming. "I didn't marry Harper because I pitied her," he wrote. "I married her because I watched her do more with less than anyone I've ever met. Because she chose her son over profit. Because she understands value better than anyone I've done business with. And because she taught me how to be a person again." They stopped laughing. And when they stopped laughing, they started watching. The ones who had called him a machine behind his back, the venture partners, the hedge fund analysts, the rivals who measured power in bloodless precision, found themselves unable to look away. Because it was no longer just about Nathan Caldwell stepping down from his firm. It wasn't about the stock dip or the whispers of weakness. It wasn't even about Mason's diagnosis or Harper's past. It was about what came next, and the uncomfortable fact that none of them could predict it. Nathan didn't return to his old office. He gave up his seat on the board and declined every offer to appear on camera. Instead, he brought Harper's code back to life. It started with an old laptop at the dining table. He read every line, every annotation. She hadn't touched it in nearly 5 years, but it was all still there, meticulously written logic, loops of learning models, patient interface scripts with notes like "too much red," "softer color needed for low-vision users." He watched her fingers hover over the keyboard like she was remembering who she used to be. "Did you ever think about selling it?" he asked. Harper shook her head. "I built it for Mason. For moms who don't get the time to build things like this because they're busy trying to keep their kids alive. I wasn't trying to be a founder, I was trying to survive." Nathan reached across the table and took her hand. "Let's do more than survive." They called it Ember, a name Harper had once scribbled in a notebook after Mason's first seizure, a word she'd held onto for years without knowing why. "Because an ember doesn't look like much," she said, "but if you protect it, it can start a fire." They rebuilt the platform in 3 months, not in an office tower, in their kitchen, between physical therapy appointments and IEP meetings, between batches of mac and cheese and bedtime stories and Mason's late-night wake-ups. They hired no PR. They took no seed funding. Nathan used his own capital under a shell company with no public footprint. They partnered with pediatricians, special education experts, parents, not advisors with impressive bios, but people who understood what the healthcare system ignored. Harper insisted on user testing with children who couldn't speak, with parents who had no tech background. "If they can't use it in 5 minutes," she said, "we start over." They launched quietly. No countdown, no keynote. Just a small link shared in an online support group for parents of kids with rare neurodisorders. The platform spread like nothing Nathan had ever seen. Within 2 weeks, 50 clinics requested demo access. Within a month, hospitals in 3 countries were running Ember in pilot programs. Within 6 weeks, a government agency reached out requesting translation into 4 languages. And yet, Harper refused to license the software to the company that had cloned her original code years ago. "I don't want money from them," she said. "I want their attention." She got it, because Ember did what none of the high-gloss platforms could. It worked. It listened. It adapted in real time to behaviors that defied simple categorization. It didn't just scan data. It learned a child. It adjusted its voice, its visuals, its rhythm. Mason used it daily. So did kids in rural clinics. So did parents without Wi-Fi, thanks to an offline mode Harper insisted on. Nathan watched it all unfold from beside her, not leading, not steering, but learning. He had spent decades investing in products that promised to change the world, but nothing had felt like this. And still they talked about them. The media called it a redemption arc. Wall Street blogs tried to frame it as a strategic pivot. Influencers called Harper the mom who broke the billionaire. She refused every interview. "No one needs to hear about me," she said. "They need to hear about the kids." But people couldn't look away, because the woman they'd once dismissed as just another struggling single mom had become something else entirely, a force, quiet, focused, relentless. One morning, Nathan woke to find Harper sitting on the floor beside Mason's bed, laptop open, dark circles under her eyes, her hair tied back with a pencil. He crouched beside her and asked if she'd slept. "I had an idea," she whispered. "Something for the kids who don't track with eye movement. Everyone's building for eyes. But some of them move with sound, vibration. I think I can map it." He watched her fingers move, fast and certain. It was the same determination that had once powered the decisions behind his most successful investments. Only hers wasn't fueled by ambition. It was built on necessity and love. Mason stirred, then opened his eyes. Harper closed the laptop and kissed his forehead. Nathan thought then about the first time he'd heard her speak. No title, no pitch, no agenda. Just a woman holding a parking meter hostage, a child waiting patiently, and the sharp dignity of someone who didn't care if the world understood her, as long as her son did. He understood now. They all did. The first mainstream news outlet to get the story right wasn't a tech site or a financial paper. It was a community radio podcast based in Philadelphia, hosted by a mother of two who recorded episodes from her closet with a used microphone and a toddler occasionally babbling in the background. The episode was titled "The Woman Who Didn't Ask Permission." Harper listened to it on the couch while folding Mason's clothes. The host had done her homework, not just on Ember, but on Harper herself, not the caricature, the truth. She built something that shouldn't exist, not because it's impossible, but because nobody with money ever bothered, the host said. And she didn't do it to get rich or famous or forgiven. She did it because she was tired of waiting for someone else to save her son. Harper sat there, a small shirt still half folded in her lap, and cried for the first time since the company went live. Nathan came in midway through the episode, heard the quote, and sat beside her. He didn't speak, just wrapped an arm around her shoulders and held her until the silence returned. After that episode, everything changed again, but not in the way it had the first time, when headlines twisted them into symbols and strangers dug through her past like it was a crime scene. This time people listened. Parents wrote letters, not emails, letters. They described children who used Ember to identify pain, to ask for food, to say, "I love you" for the first time. They sent videos, scribbled drawings. One mother sent a necklace her daughter had made from macaroni and string because she said Harper built the thing that helped my voice come out. Hospitals that had ignored Harper's cold emails a year earlier now requested partnerships. Pediatricians called her a peer. Advocacy groups invited her to speak, not about her journey, but about her work. She declined most offers. Instead, she built. She hired engineers who were also parents, many of whom had left the tech world after being told their empathy was a distraction. She created a policy where every developer spent 2 hours a week inside a clinic or school shadowing children using Ember. She paid every consultant in full, even when they said they'd work for free. If we don't value their time, she told Nathan, how can we say the system should? Nathan watched her build a company with none of the usual rules and all of the right ones. He who had once torn apart entire divisions for not hitting margins. He who had never known the names of the employees 3 tiers beneath him. Now he stood in a room where a 7-year-old in a wheelchair was considered part of the design team because her feedback on color contrast had changed an entire update cycle. One night, Nathan caught Harper staring at a whiteboard filled with sticky notes, each one labeled with a child's name and a feature request. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I used to think my job was to protect Mason from the world," she said. "Now I think it's to make a world that doesn't need protecting from." Nathan didn't answer. There was nothing he could say that would do the moment justice, so he just stood there, in awe of the woman the world had laughed at, and helped her color-code the notes for tomorrow's planning meeting. A few months later, Ember's user base crossed 500,000. Harper didn't throw a party. She sat in the garden, knees pulled to her chest, watching Mason trace clouds with his fingers. Nathan sat beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "you could have sold this company 100 times over by now." She looked at him, expression unreadable. "And then what?" "You'd be set for life." "I already am," she said. He reached for her hand. "Then what comes next?" She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We keep going," she said, "until every child who needs to be heard is." And they did. 6 months after Ember crossed the 1-million-user threshold, a man showed up at their door. He didn't wear a suit, didn't arrive in a town car, just khakis, an old messenger bag, and a cautious smile. Harper opened the door, expecting a courier, maybe a neighbor's visitor, but he said her name, softly, and she froze. "Harper Wade?" he asked. "Yes. I think you knew my daughter." Harper blinked. "I'm sorry?" He reached into his bag and pulled out a photo. It was weather-worn, folded in half. A girl with curly hair, dimples, and the kind of smile that never photographs right because it belongs in motion. "Maya," he said. "She went to your preschool 15 years ago. You were her teacher." Harper remembered. Not her face, not at first, but her laugh. Loud, whole body, unapologetic. She'd been 5 and nonverbal, but had communicated everything she needed with expression alone. Maya had loved paints. Purple in particular. She'd mixed it into everything. Harper had once stayed late cleaning purple fingerprints off the walls, and never regretted it. "She passed 3 years ago," the man said. "Complications, no warning, but before that, she started speaking." Harper's breath caught. "Not with words," he added, "with a prototype, one of the old ones. I was cleaning her closet out last week and found a folder. Your name was on the first page, Ember's logo, dated 6 years ago." Harper couldn't speak. I needed you to know," he said. "Before she died, she told me she loved me. It came out of that machine, one word at a time. She even said purple when I painted her room. I never knew she noticed." Harper invited him in. They sat in the kitchen. She made tea. Mason wandered in halfway through and sat beside her, quiet but curious. The man, David, pulled out a flash drive. "She made recordings," he said. "For you, I think. I don't know why. Just said, 'Miss Harper for when she forgets.'" Harper plugged it into her laptop with shaking fingers. There were 3 files. The first was a musical hum, rhythm, patterned in sequences only someone with Ember's signature algorithms would know how to play. The second was a robotic voice saying, slowly but clearly, "Thank you for seeing me." The third was silence, 8 seconds long. Harper listened to that one 3 times before she realized it wasn't silence. It was a breath, Maya's, slow, steady, a final exhale. She hit stop and sat very still. "Sometimes I wonder if I did enough," she whispered. David shook his head. You gave her a voice, and me a daughter I truly met. After he left, Harper didn't cry. She walked into the garden, sat beside Mason, and handed him her phone. He pressed play and listened to the breath. He looked at her, head tilted. Was that her? Yes, Harper said. He held the phone close, replaying it. She sounds calm. She was. They sat there as the sun dipped low and the wind chimes began their nightly music. Somewhere inside the house, Nathan watched from the kitchen window, a hand resting against the glass, memorizing the shape of Harper's silhouette beside their son. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew now what real investment was, what legacy meant, and that all the noise in the world couldn't drown out the power of being heard at last. Harper rarely slept through the night anymore, not because something was wrong, but because something was always calling. Ideas arrived in the dark. Code whispered itself to her between 3 and 4 a.m., precise as a heartbeat. She'd wake slowly, careful not to disturb Mason, where he lay, curled against the body pillow that helped ease the tension in his hips, and slip into the living room, still wrapped in sleep, hair wild, barefoot on the cold tile floor. There she'd open her laptop, fingers already moving before the screen fully lit. She didn't drink coffee during these hours. She didn't need it. The rhythm of building was enough. Writing new code, refining features, sketching interface changes by hand on scrap paper when the keyboard felt too rigid. She always started from the same place. What is the child trying to say that no one else knows how to hear? That question had become the heart of Ember, not how to fix, not how to educate, not how to measure, how to listen. Across the hallway, Nathan often stirred when she left the room but never followed. He'd learned that Harper's early mornings weren't times to insert himself, weren't problems to solve. They were holy in their own way, a ritual of quiet defiance. He'd lie awake sometimes, hands folded behind his head, and think about all the years he'd spent chasing numbers, all the nights he'd spent pacing boardroom floors or sitting beneath fluorescent lights trying to will clarity out of chaos, and how none of it had ever felt this alive. He thought about how Harper never asked for permission, not to build, not to mother, not to dream. Even now, with Ember expanding into international markets, with clinics on 4 continents using her software, with emails arriving hourly from researchers and specialists and engineers offering to join her mission, she still woke up in the dark and began again from scratch, like none of it was guaranteed. Like the only thing that mattered was the next child, the next voice. One morning he rose earlier than usual, found her asleep at the table, chin resting on her folded arms, laptop still glowing. Mason's voice, pre-recorded, played softly through a pair of headphones lying askew beside her. Not words, just a sequence of vowel sounds, stretched and looped and layered in soft harmony. A soundscape, a memory, maybe. He reached over and gently closed the lid of the laptop, not to stop her work, just to give her a moment of peace. He lifted her carefully, carried her back to bed, and lay beside her, holding her close while outside the first signs of dawn painted the sky in blush and silver. The days were full now. Ember had grown beyond anything either of them imagined. Not as a company, not in the traditional sense. Harper refused to take it public, refused to accept acquisition offers from firms with glossy mission statements and hollow promises. She wasn't building a product, she was rebuilding trust. The team operated remotely, most of them working from their own homes while caring for children, parents, or themselves. There were weekly check-ins, but no set hours, no quotas, no buzzwords, just shared values. Harper called it adaptive structure, and it worked because everyone in the system had once been told they didn't belong in the old one. Each update they rolled out came with a series of user videos, kids and parents reacting to the changes, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, sometimes just sitting quietly beside a screen that now understood them a little better. These videos weren't shared publicly. They weren't testimonials. They were rituals. Proof that progress wasn't a pitch. It was presence. In one video, a girl in Brazil used Ember to say, "My head hurts," for the first time. Her mother burst into tears and whispered, "I always thought she was just tired." In another, a boy in Ukraine used the vibration function to tell his older sister he missed her. She'd been away at university. She drove 6 hours home that night. Harper watched every video. Sometimes she watched them twice. On the hard days, when Mason's seizures returned, or the bureaucracy of medical policy tried to stall their reach, she played them while sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, her head resting on Nathan's shoulder, Mason asleep between them. They were building something that couldn't be undone. It wasn't about Harper anymore. It wasn't even about Mason. It was about every child who had been left in the margins, every parent who had stopped asking for help because they were tired of being told no. Ember was a yes in a world that had forgotten how to say it. And Nathan, who had once been hailed as the coldest man on Wall Street, now spent his days writing grants, taking meetings with disability rights groups, and researching hardware integration so Ember could reach children with the oldest, cheapest tablets available. He didn't lead. He supported. He listened. He learned. Sometimes, late at night, he'd look at Harper, curled on the couch, glasses sliding down her nose, Mason's hand in hers, and feel his throat tighten with something too large to name. He had once thought love was a luxury, something earned through perfection or performance. Now he knew it was something else entirely. It was watching someone choose truth over recognition again and again. It was helping them carry a weight you would never fully understand but would never let them bear alone. It was waking up every day and asking, "How can I serve the people I love better?" It was watching the world finally stop laughing and start following. Harper didn't notice at first when Ember's name began to show up in unexpected places. At a tech expo in Singapore, a small booth at the back displayed her early interface on a mounted screen. A sign beneath it read, "Inspired by Ember's listening logic." At a medical conference in Oslo, a panelist casually referenced the Harper method while discussing AI compassion modeling. She heard about it from emails, forwarded screenshots, translated transcripts. Her reaction was always the same: surprise, then a quiet shake of her head. "They're not my ideas," she told Nathan one night, curled up under a blanket, Mason asleep beside them. "They're the world's. I just listened first." But people still came. Letters from schools, clinics, parents, students. Some mailed hand-drawn pictures. Others included pages torn from notebooks, annotated with ideas. New features, better layouts, questions about implementation. Harper kept every one. They filled a shoebox, then two. Then she bought a filing cabinet and labeled each drawer by country. One letter came from a school for nonverbal children in Nairobi. The teacher wrote, "Our children used to speak only in behaviors. Now they speak in songs. Your code gave us lyrics." Another arrived from a foster home in New Mexico. A therapist wrote, "3 of our children used Ember to write their first apology, and they meant it." The most unexpected letter came from a man Harper hadn't thought about in years. Her first investor. The one who had smiled kindly while saying she was too early, too ambitious, too unknown. He now ran a think tank on ethical machine learning and had just discovered Ember. His letter was short. "I see it now. I'm sorry I didn't then." Harper read it once, folded it, slipped it into the back of the cabinet. She didn't need his apology, but she was glad he understood. One afternoon, Mason came home from school holding a form. He slapped it on the kitchen table and pointed at the line for parent signature. "What's this?" Harper asked, picking it up. "Science fair," he said. "I'm doing a project on adaptive memory." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Your own design?" Mason nodded. Harper grinned. "What's the hypothesis?" "That kids like me remember things differently, not worse." just sideways. They helped him build it, an interface that mapped recall by sensory patterns instead of time. He tested it on classmates, tracked their answers, built a chart. On the day of the fair, his table was modest. A tablet, a printout, a small speaker that played snippets of music and rain sounds. He didn't win. The prize went to a boy who built a volcano that erupted blue foam. But Mason didn't care. He came home smiling, holding a ribbon that said, "Most Innovative." At dinner, he said, "Next year, I'll do a project on Ember." Harper blinked. Why? Because people don't know where it came from. Nathan watched her go still. Mason didn't notice. He kept eating, casual. Everyone thinks it's a startup. They don't know it started here, on this table, with you. Harper didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, curled her fingers around her son's, and said, "Then you tell them." Mason did. The next year, his science fair project wasn't about software. It was about Harper. A timeline drawn in marker across 6 panels, the birth of an idea, the building of code, the failure, the decision to walk away. And then the spark, the moment Mason watched his mother rebuild not just Ember, but herself. He ended the presentation with a quote. She didn't wait for anyone to say yes. She wrote her own invitation. The photo of the display went viral. Harper never commented, never gave a statement, but she framed the ribbon. Nathan hung it in the hallway beside the first check Ember ever received. And sometimes, when people visited the house, friends, staff, parents, they would pause and look at those two things, the ribbon and the check. Side by side, one worth $10,000, the other worth everything. When autumn arrived, it came slowly, like it didn't want to disturb the rhythm of the house. The trees lining the back fence turned amber, then gold, shedding leaves one by one that Mason would collect on his walks and tape to the inside of the living room windows. Harper watched them flutter gently in the breeze each time someone opened the front door, a mosaic of motion, and thought about how this was the only kind of clock she trusted now, the slow changing of seasons, the reliable turning of days, shaped not by deadlines but by presence. Ember had reached 5 million users by then. It was being used in 47 countries, translated into 17 languages, and had sparked 3 independent studies on the emotional development of children who previously had no reliable way to communicate. The data was staggering, but Harper never quoted it. When asked, she always said the same thing. Numbers matter, but names matter more. So, instead of PowerPoints, she carried letters. Notes from parents scribbled in the margins of test results, crayon drawings mailed from faraway classrooms. One had come just the week before, a photograph of a child in a hospital bed, fingers curled around a screen, face lit up in concentration. The note read, "He told us he didn't want the green juice. He's never said no before. Thank you for giving him a way to push back." Harper pinned that one to the kitchen corkboard. She looked at it every morning. The truth was, the closer Ember got to the center of the world's attention, the further Harper retreated from it. She turned down speaking engagements, deferred interviews. She refused to let anyone license her code unless they agreed to her terms in full accessibility, full affordability, full transparency. "You're too strict," one executive warned. "I'm not trying to be liked," she replied. "I'm trying to build something that lasts." She kept her team small and tight. She paid them well. She gave them time off when they needed it and never asked them to choose between family and work. They didn't wear branded shirts or use Slack emojis, but their weekly meetings often ended in laughter, and once a month they had a playlist party. Everyone submitted one sound that described their week, and Harper arranged them into a song. They called it The Pulse. Nathan sometimes sat in the corner during those sessions, listening, not taking notes, just watching her work. There was a calmness in Harper that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with clarity. She didn't posture. She didn't pretend, and she never asked for more than what she was willing to give. The press had stopped asking why he married her. Now they asked what they could learn from her. She never answered, but the ones who paid attention realized that was the answer. In October, Harper got a letter from a woman named Mila in Warsaw. Her daughter Ada had begun using Ember 6 months prior after suffering a traumatic brain injury. At first, Ada could only select colors, then shapes, then audio cues. 2 weeks before the letter, she'd used Ember to say "stop" when a nurse tried to turn her without warning. That same day, she used it again. "Stay," she told her mother. "I didn't know she needed me there," Mila wrote. "I thought I was just hovering, but she asked me to stay. For the first time in her life, not with her eyes, with her voice." Harper cried reading it. Then she printed it, framed it, and added it to the wall beside Mason's ribbon. That wall was full now. Dozens of notes, photos, letters, stories, evidence. One evening, Mason stood beside it, arms crossed. "You should call this the real timeline," he said. "All the stuff that matters." Harper smiled. "You think so?" "Yeah, anyone can make an app, but not everyone changes someone's forever." Then he added, "You did?" Nathan, watching from the kitchen, turned away to hide the tears in his eyes. Later that night, after Mason was asleep and the house was quiet, Harper sat with Nathan on the back porch. The wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the yard. Somewhere in the trees a wind chime rang, the one Mason had made years ago from old keys and bits of colored wire. "I think I want to start a school," Harper said suddenly. Nathan turned to her. "A school? Not just for kids who use Ember. For anyone who learns sideways. I want to make a place where nobody has to apologize for how they think." He nodded slowly. "You'll need space, funding, staff." "I know," she said, "but it starts the same way Ember did. One table, one question, one child." Nathan smiled. "Then we'll start there." And just like that, they began again. They started by clearing out the garage, the same one where Harper had rebuilt Ember beside the washing machine, and a line of hanging laundry where Mason had once rolled paint-covered toy cars across butcher paper while she coded algorithms that would change the way the world listened. Nathan pulled down old shelves. Harper boxed up spare monitors, broken adapters, a stack of early prototypes she couldn't bring herself to delete. They swept the floor, patched the cracks in the drywall, opened the windows, and let in the light. The first student came within a week. Her name was Jaya. She was 11, diagnosed with auditory processing disorder and social anxiety. She'd been pulled from 3 schools in 2 years. Each report said the same thing: unwilling to participate, resistant to group work, emotionally volatile. Her mother, a nurse who worked night shifts and slept in the car between appointments, emailed Harper on a whim. "She listens to Ember songs on loop," the woman wrote. "I think she's hearing something no one else has." Harper invited them over. Jaya didn't speak during the first session. She didn't meet Harper's eyes, but she didn't leave either. She sat cross-legged in the corner of the garage and watched. When Harper placed a soundboard in front of her and told her she could press anything, anytime, for any reason. Jaya waited 17 minutes before pressing a single tone, then another, then a third, a pattern. She built her sentence in sound. Harper didn't interrupt. She simply recorded the tones and let Jaya replay them. The next day, Jaya came back with a notebook full of color-coded sequences and a sketch of a bird inside a circle. "This is how I think," she said. "In loops, not lines." Harper cleared off a whole wall and gave it to her. Jaya filled it in 5 days. After that, more students came, not because of a flyer or a website. There was none. They came because someone whispered to someone else, and the message spread. There's a place where your child won't be told to change. There's a woman building something that doesn't hurt to learn in. Within a month, the garage was full. Nathan built an extension. knocked down the rear wall, poured a new foundation, installed windows that filtered harsh light. He kept the original beam with Mason's height notches, carving a new one beside it labeled Ideas. Mason took attendance every morning. They called it the listening room. Not a school, not a center, a room for children who needed to be heard. Harper structured the day with rhythm, not clocks. Sound walks at sunrise, journaling after lunch, silence blocks between lessons. Every child received a headset tuned to their sensory needs. No bells, no grating. Feedback came through conversation, art, or music. Some kids spoke, some didn't. Some screamed, some sang. All were welcome. A boy named Ellis brought in broken radios and rebuilt them into speakers that played heartbeat frequencies. A girl named Lena taught herself how to build interactive maps with only her elbow and a stylus. One nonverbal student created an app that used facial heat maps to detect when she was overwhelmed, flashing a blue light when she needed space. Harper documented none of it for publication. She archived it in notebooks, bound them by hand, gave one to each child when they left. Their record, their rhythm, their truth. One evening, Harper stood in the back of the listening room while the students gave a sound recital. Not music in the traditional sense, but sound as they defined it. Chimes, whispers, tapping, layered frequencies. A 6-year-old recorded her laughter in a jar, replayed it through water. Mason used his old speech app to tell the story of his first seizure, ending with the words, "But now I speak." The parents cried, not because their children had performed, because they had been witnessed. Harper didn't take the stage. She stood in the back, watching. Nathan found her there, eyes glassy, hands clasped. "You know," he said quietly, "they still talk about you like you're a miracle." "I'm not," Harper whispered. "No," he agreed. "You're something harder. You kept going." And she had, from nothing. From late nights and broken machines and grief too deep for language. From a moment in front of a parking meter when the world was too heavy and too loud. She had kept going, and now they listened. By the time winter curled around the edges of the town, the listening room had grown into something Harper never could have named at the start. It wasn't a school. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't a facility. It was a place. Alive, breathing, shaped by the people inside it. The walls were filled with layers of creation, sound maps that looked like galaxies, paper circuits built by children with hands that trembled, and chalk murals that shimmered in the cold light spilling through wide windows. Some days were chaotic, full of flapping hands and frustrated outbursts, headphones discarded mid-session, a sudden storm of panic that rushed through the room like wind. Other days were still, silent children sitting shoulder to shoulder, tapping fingers to shared rhythms. Harper had learned not to plan too tightly. She had learned to let the current lead. They had 27 regular students by January. Jaya, who now designed sound sequences that changed depending on the room's temperature. Ellis, who taught the others how to tune copper wire by ear. Nina, who still hadn't spoken, but had written 15 poems using symbols she'd designed herself. And Mason, who began every morning with the same sentence through his app, "Welcome to your sound." The community began to take notice. Teachers, therapists, pediatricians, they started referring students not with paperwork, but with soft conversations in coffee shops and late-night emails that read, "I have one. I think they need you." Harper never said no. She only asked one question. What do they love? One afternoon, a new child named Noor arrived. She was 8 and recently placed in foster care. Her file described her as non-compliant, emotionally erratic, with a tendency to bolt. Her foster mother arrived with an apology already in her mouth. "She's not like the others. She doesn't sit still. She doesn't have to," Harper said. Noor didn't bolt. She didn't speak either, but she ran her hands over the floor like she was searching for something buried. "Do you want to feel sound?" Harper asked her. Noor nodded once. Harper placed a small speaker on the floor and played a low frequency that pulsed like a distant drum. Then she handed Noor a balloon and let her hold it against the vibration. For 20 minutes, Noor didn't move. Her eyes were closed, her face unreadable. Then she said, "It feels like when I used to lie on my mom's chest." The next day, she came back with a drawing of waves wrapped around a heart. She hung it on the wall without asking. Harper wrote her name on the whiteboard in silver. Noor, Sound 28. The numbers weren't ranks. They weren't identifiers. They were positions in a constellation. Each child a note. Each week a new arrangement. Nathan watched all of it unfold, not from the front, but from behind the scenes. He fixed things, installing shelves, adjusting light levels, balancing the heating system so the air never felt too sharp. He kept a toolbox in the back room, next to Harper's sound files and the wall of letters from parents. When things broke, he fixed them quietly. When he didn't know how, he learned. At night, when the children were gone, and the lights dimmed low, he and Harper walked the room in silence. Sometimes she would play something from the day. One child's voice looped over a heartbeat, or a sequence of tones that Jaya called "rain that doesn't fall." "This isn't a project anymore," Nathan said one night, leaning against the old beam that still bore Mason's first height mark. "It's a movement." Harper looked up at the walls, at the way the chalk shimmered like music trying to become visible. "No," she said, "it's a reply." "To what?" She smiled faintly. "To all the people who said these kids had nothing to say." And that was it. The truth behind all of it. They had never been building for recognition, not for grants or policy or legacy. They had been building a reply, and the world had started listening back. In February, the listening room received its first visitor from the Department of Education. Not an inspector, not an auditor, just a woman named Camille, who had heard about the place from a colleague with a child in the program. She arrived in the middle of a sound circle session where Mason and 2 other students were tapping rhythms on the floor while Harper sat nearby, not guiding, just watching. The room didn't pause for Camille. No one asked the children to stop or change what they were doing. Camille stood in the doorway for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she sat down, shoes off, hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide and wet by the end of the session. Afterward, she approached Harper. "What exactly is this?" she asked. "It's not a school, it's not a lab, it's not a clinic." "It's a room," Harper replied. "A listening room." "For what?" Harper smiled. "For the parts of children that usually get ignored." Camille nodded. "Do you have metrics?" "No," Harper said. "We have stories." "And do the stories change outcomes?" "They are the outcomes." Camille returned a week later, this time with 2 more visitors, one from the state's Alternative Education Division and another from a university research team focused on cognitive development. Neither carried clipboards. They were told in advance, no testing, no recordings, no observing without participation. They came, they listened, they cried. Then they left in silence. A month later, the listening room was invited to present at a national conference on inclusive learning models. Harper declined the keynote slot and instead sent 3 of the students, including Mason, who gave a demonstration using modified audio pads and scent triggers that mapped emotional response in real time. The room gave them a standing ovation. Harper watched the live stream from the kitchen, Mason's ribbon still hanging beside her. After the demonstration, the conference director called her directly. "We'd like to fund your expansion," she said. "We can help scale this." Harper hesitated. "You want to scale listening?" "We want to build more rooms across the country with your name on them." Harper looked out the window where Noor was painting sound waves on a planter box while Jaya narrated wind patterns. "Then you need to understand," Harper said. "You can build more rooms, but you can't franchise listening. Every place has to grow from its own silence." The director paused, then said, That might be the most important thing anyone's ever said to me in this job. So they didn't franchise. They didn't license. They taught. Harper and Nathan created a training curriculum. Not a manual, but a conversation. It came in a box, a journal, a set of sound recordings from the original listening room, a deck of questions, and a blank floor plan with a single note written in the top corner. Leave space for what you didn't expect. Rooms began to appear, slowly. One in Vermont, one in Tulsa, one in the back of a mosque in Dearborn. Each one different. Each one started by someone who had sat in silence long enough to realize what the world was missing. And Harper kept going. She still rose before the sun, still checked Ember updates while Mason slept beside her, still returned every letter, still wrote down every story. She filled books, boxes, cabinets. She never published them, but she remembered every name. One night, as a storm rolled in and the chimes outside clanged like laughter, Mason asked her a question. "Do you think Jonah would have liked it here?" Harper turned, startled. "Jonah? I heard Dad say his name once. To the wall. I think he was someone." Harper sat beside him on the bed, tucked the blanket tighter around his legs. "Jonah was a boy who helped your father remember how to feel," she said. "He's why we built this." Mason nodded. "I think I would have liked him. I think he would have loved you." Later, Harper found Nathan at the window, staring into the dark. "You never told me much about him," she said softly. "He was the first song I ever heard clearly," Nathan replied. "Before you, before Mason, he was the beginning." Harper rested her head against his shoulder. "And you're the reply," he whispered. Outside, the rain began to fall, slow, rhythmic, like memory. Inside, the house pulsed with quiet music, laughter in another room, a fan clicking in a corner, breathing, always breathing. And the world kept listening. In March, snow still clung to the edges of the streets, but inside the listening room, spring had already begun. Not in temperature, but in movement. Everything felt like thaw. Noor had begun singing, not loudly, not words, but tones that matched the color of her paintings. Ellis had built a vibration tunnel using mattress coils and speaker wire. When children crawled through it, they came out laughing, hair standing on end. Jaya had organized a quiet protest, leaving chalk messages on the sidewalk outside City Hall that read, "We are not hard to teach. You just haven't learned to see us." Someone photographed it. The image spread. Again. This time, it was different. There were no headlines about the billionaire or the single mom, no speculation about motives or strategy. The story was about the children. It was about the learning model built from breath and rhythm, about the kids who learned to speak in taps, in color, in patterns. It was about the listening room and the growing understanding that it was not an exception, but a map. Within days, Harper's inbox overflowed. Not with money, with questions. "How do we make one here? How do we begin? Can you come teach us how to listen?" She wrote back to every single one. Each reply began the same. "Start with a space. Make it safe. Let them speak." She didn't send architecture plans. She sent sound, clips of wind, laughter slowed down, the hum of fluorescent lights when children flinch, the sound of fingers on a paper cup, a pencil tapping a desk, the thump of a foot under a chair trying to keep a rhythm that no one else notices. She sent these not as templates, but as invitations. And slowly, rooms began to appear in places she'd never been. In an empty church basement in Detroit, a teacher lined the walls with foam and used milk crates for chairs. In a small school in Chennai, children sat barefoot on mats and clapped syllables until they found a song. In Dublin, a family converted their garage and invited neighborhood kids to come after school. No expectations, no tests, just presence. They didn't call them listening rooms, not all of them, but they kept the spirit. They let the quiet be a teacher, and Ember kept growing. Harper released an update that included a new tool designed by Mason, a visual journal that translated daily sensory input into patterns. It didn't ask children to describe their day in words. It asked, "What did the world feel like today?" Then it let them show you. The tool was used by 300,000 children in its first month. Harper never mentioned the number publicly, but she cried the night she saw Mason using it to describe the moment his favorite song played while they were stuck in traffic. He tapped blue, then silver, then a shimmer that meant, "I forgot I was afraid." Nathan held her that night quietly, without words. He no longer missed his old life, not even a little. Not the suits, the silence in elevators, the long boardroom tables where no one ever made eye contact unless it was calculated. He used to win deals by speaking last. Now he won days by listening first. He and Harper barely spoke of the past anymore. Their love wasn't a reaction. It was a practice, built in dishwashing and long walks, in watching Mason sleep, in hammering nails into new door frames and rearranging cushions before new students arrived. One night, Harper found a letter in Mason's backpack. It was addressed to whoever you are. It read, "I used to think I was broken. I used to think I was wrong. But then I came here, and now I think I'm a song." She showed it to Nathan. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her close and stayed there. Long after the lights were off, long after the house had gone still, they remained in that silence, deep, full, unmistakably sacred. The kind of silence that only comes when the world, at last, understands what it has been missing, and stops and listens. The seasons turned again without announcement. Spring gave way to a soft summer, the kind that arrived slowly and respectfully, as if it had learned to tread quietly through a place that had become so finely tuned to silence, breath, rhythm. The listening room no longer belonged just to the neighborhood. It had become a destination, not of spectacle, but of pilgrimage. Educators came not for training, but to unlearn. Parents came not for answers, but for permission to feel. Policymakers came hoping to leave with numbers, only to find that what they really needed was a moment of stillness beside a child building a sentence out of color. By June, there were over 30 satellite spaces inspired by the original listening room, none of them identical, none of them institutional. They had names like the Sound Table, the Pause School, and Echo House. Some operated in libraries, some in repurposed homes, some in tents where walls were made of moving air, and the curriculum was shaped by weather. Harper insisted on nothing being franchised, but everything being honored. Every time someone reached out to replicate what she had built, she responded with the same sentence: "You don't need a model. You need to start by sitting down and shutting up." Most were startled by her bluntness. But the ones who understood, the ones who returned, were the ones who stayed. Nathan handled most of the administrative overflow now. He fielded calls, filtered requests, booked flights when Harper occasionally agreed to speak, not at conferences, but at the spaces themselves. She only visited places where children were already shaping the air, where she could kneel next to them and learn. The first such trip was to a former auto shop turned listening room outside Columbus. The founders were two young women, former behavior therapists who'd walked away from their clinic jobs after watching a child get forcibly removed from a room for humming. "We thought we were fixing him," one of them told Harper, "but it turns out he was fixing us. We just weren't listening." Harper spent 2 days there. She sat on the concrete floor, watched a group of children build sculptures out of tin cans and wind chimes, and said nothing. When she was asked to speak, she simply stood in front of the group and played a recording of her own breathing. It lasted 28 seconds. At the end, she said, "That's what I needed when I was 25. Someone to hear that I was drowning without needing to call it resilience." She got on a train that night and rode home in silence, Mason asleep on her shoulder, a stack of letters from children folded neatly in her bag. At home, the listening room was evolving again. Mason had begun hosting his own sound circles, not formally. He just started gathering kids during free play and asking them what their bodies felt like today. Then he'd match it to a note. The others followed. They created a whole system of physical emotional translation using tones and textures. They called it mapping the inside. Harper watched from a distance, heart full. She saw the way the kids trusted Mason, not because he spoke more clearly now, he did, or because he was the founder's son, he never mentioned it, but because he led with questions. One day, during a break, she sat with him under the old apricot tree. "You're really good at this," she said. He shrugged. "I just like hearing people." "Where'd you learn that?" He looked at her with a small smile. "From you, but you didn't say it with words." That night, Harper opened one of her old notebooks, the one she hadn't touched in years. Inside were her earliest ember diagrams, her first algorithms, raw and flawed and brilliant. She flipped past pages until she found a line she'd written in the margins of a feedback model. "How do we build something that doesn't need us to be perfect to work?" She underlined it. That had always been the point. The next morning, she met with her team and proposed something radical. Sunset Ember. Not end it, not erase it, but decentralize it. Release the code. Let others build on it without needing permission. Make it public domain. "You're sure?" Nathan asked later that evening, watching her rub lotion into her hands, eyes tired but peaceful. "Yes," she said, "it's grown beyond me, and it should keep growing." "What will you do?" She smiled. "Keep listening." So they did. They open-sourced Ember on the anniversary of its first beta launch. They uploaded every tool, every algorithm, every annotation Harper had written. They included a note from Mason that read, "We hope you make something beautiful." Within weeks, there were Ember variations being used in cities Harper had never heard of, one in coastal Peru, where fishermen used it to translate navigation instructions for crew members with learning disabilities. Another in a refugee camp in Lebanon, where therapists were using it to help children process trauma through image-to-sound journaling. Another in rural Japan, where a grandmother had modified the code so her grandson, who refused speech therapy, could order dinner by building meals in musical scales. None of it came back to Harper, and that was perfect, because she hadn't built a company. She had built a compass, and now the world was charting its own way forward. By August, the listening room's waiting list stretched across 3 counties. Harper didn't advertise. There were no application forms, no income thresholds, no referrals required. Word simply traveled, carried by parents who had found something rare. Space without shame. Teachers whispered about it in break rooms. Therapists scribbled the address in the corners of session notes. Children who had once hidden in the back of classrooms now asked their caregivers, "Can I go where the walls don't yell?" The garage-turned-studio had long since overflowed its original purpose. Nathan and a few local volunteers had added a new wing with wide doors and cork floors, dimmable lights, and curved walls to reduce echo. They called it the Soft Hall. It didn't have classrooms. It had nooks. Reading dens made of blankets, texture gardens, a sensory kitchen where children could learn math by baking, and rhythm by measuring flour to the beat of their breath. Every addition was purposeful. Every choice made with consultation from the only people who mattered, the children. One afternoon, Mason called an impromptu meeting in the Soft Hall. He stood at the front with his tablet, his voice clear through the speaker. "We should build a forest inside." The room paused. Someone giggled. "I mean it," he said. "Not real trees, but we can hang leaves from the ceiling, leaves with sounds. Everyone gets one. We'll call it the canopy." Harper, sitting cross-legged beside a boy stacking tactile blocks, looked up and simply nodded. "Let's do it." Within a week, they had over 80 leaves, fabric cutouts strung with sound chips. Each leaf held a recording. Some were words, some were songs. One was just a hum, another a child's whispered laugh. Visitors would walk beneath the canopy, pull a string, and hear a world they'd never known existed. A journalist came to do a story. He expected an interview. Harper offered a tour instead. He walked the rooms, listened to the canopy, watched a girl build a language out of paint strokes. At the end, he turned to Harper and said, "You're disrupting education." She frowned. "No, I'm restoring it." The article went viral anyway. Harper stopped answering her phone for 2 days. Nathan took her hiking somewhere quiet, where Mason could splash in a stream and she could stare at the sky without being asked what her 5-year plan was. In that silence, she turned to Nathan and said, "I think I want to disappear for a while." He didn't panic. "Just rest," she added, "not vanish. Just let other voices rise." "Then let's build something they can rise from," Nathan said. And they did. They formed the table, a rotating advisory made up of teenagers who had once been students in the listening room. Jaya, Ellis, Noor, and Mason led the first cohort. Their mission was simple: protect the roots while growing the canopy. No hierarchy, no fixed roles. Decisions were made in circles. Every child had veto power. Every adult had to justify their opinion not with expertise, but with experience. They made mistakes, they course-corrected, they thrived. Meanwhile, Harper pulled back, not from care, but from center. She stopped facilitating groups. She let others carry the sound. She spent more time in the garden with Mason, tending to tomatoes and picking mint. She wrote letters longhand to friends she hadn't seen in years. She started journaling again, but not about programs or plans, about mornings, Mason's questions, the way Nathan hummed when he cooked. She let herself be soft, human, whole. One day Mason brought her a question. "Do you remember the first thing I ever said with Ember?" She paused, smiled. "You said, 'again.'" He nodded. "I didn't mean the sound." "I know," she said. "You meant the moment." "Do you think he asked, "we could make the listening room forever?" "I think we already did," she said. "Because forever isn't how long it lasts. It's how deeply it's felt." And he understood, just like that. Another day, another echo, another note in a song they hadn't finished and never would. Because it wasn't meant to end. It was meant to carry, meant to hold, meant to invite others to listen, to stay, to build, to believe. By the time the leaves began to fall again, the listening room had become something of a landmark. Not in the tourist sense, not with plaques or crowds or guided tours, but as a quiet constellation that people followed, not because they had heard about it, but because they had felt its gravity. Word didn't spread like wildfire. It spread like warmth. One parent to another, one child to a teacher, one note passed in a locker, one whisper across a dinner table. There's a place you can go where no one tries to fix you. There were now over 50 spaces across the country shaped by its philosophy. Some in cities, some in towns so small they didn't appear on maps. Some were built in converted barns. Some took over unused sections of public libraries. One lived on a ferry, another in a rooftop greenhouse. The name didn't matter. Some still called them listening rooms. Others used names in other languages. Some had no names at all, just doors. Open ones. Harper hadn't stepped into the spotlight for over a year, not because she was hiding, because she was watching. She sat in back corners during student exhibitions. She walked barefoot through sound gardens. She swept chalk dust from the hallways before morning sessions. She listened. And what she heard was more than enough. Children who once stared at the ground when spoken to were now directing soundscapes with teams of other students. Teenagers who had aged out of school systems that never accommodated them were returning to teach. Parents who had once clung to hope by a thread were now organizing support circles and running community events. One mother who had never finished high school began teaching basic electronics after her son, who had never spoken, used Ember to tell her, "You're my favorite scientist." Harper cried for hours after hearing that. Then she got up and built her a lab. Nathan kept building too. He oversaw renovations, designed furniture with soft edges, rewired lights that hummed too loud, tuned doors so they closed gently. He found joy in the things no one noticed, because they weren't supposed to. His work was about quiet, about safety, about eliminating the static so that the real music could rise. Sometimes, late at night, he and Harper would sit outside under the old apricot tree, watching the canopy sway with wind chimes that didn't match, didn't harmonize, but somehow still belonged together. One evening, Mason joined them. He was taller now, more independent, his speech clearer, though he still relied on Ember for long conversations and complex emotions. He sat cross-legged on the grass and looked up through the branches. "Do you think," he said slowly, "people like us will always need a special place?" Harper looked at him, then at Nathan. "I think," she said, "the world is slowly becoming one, but it's slow." "It is," Nathan said, "but it's real." They sat in silence for a while until Mason added, "I want to build my own someday." "What would it be?" Harper asked. He smiled. "A room that listens. To adults?" They laughed, but they knew he was serious. He always was. Mason began drafting blueprints the next day, not in AutoCAD or on a laptop, with pencils, on paper, with sketches that showed walls made of books and rugs made of sound. He called it the after room, a place for grown-ups to relearn stillness, where every visitor would be asked gently, "When did someone last hear you?" Harper gave him the back shed to work in. Nathan helped him install insulation and rewire the lighting. Mason painted the door blue. By winter, a dozen adults had already come through. They didn't talk much about what happened inside, but they always came out lighter. Some left notes in the mailbox. "Thank you for letting me fall apart quietly. This was the first time I wasn't performing. I didn't know I was allowed to not have an answer." Harper watched it unfold, awe building in her chest. And one morning, standing in the cold air with frost on the windows, she whispered, "He did it." Nathan looked at her. "Who?" "Jonah," she said. "He's still speaking?" And he was, through Mason, through Ember, through every child who had ever pressed a button and said, "Again." Through every adult who stepped into a room, trembling, and left standing taller, through silence, through sound, through everything they had built, not to be seen, but to be heard. In December, snow settled softly over the roof of the listening room, muting the world like a hand over a heart. It was the kind of snow that blanketed everything without hurry, layering silence over silence, a hush that Harper had always loved. The children arrived, bundled in coats and mismatched gloves, their breath clouding in front of them, laughter rising in plumes as they stomped the snow off their boots and entered the warm, humming rooms. Inside, the canopy had been transformed for winter. The sound leaves now included whispers of fires crackling, pages turning, wind threading through bare trees. Noor had recorded her grandmother singing a lullaby in Farsi and hung it near the entrance, so the room greeted visitors with something soft and ancient. Jaya composed a tone sequence that translated snowfall into rhythm and built a pedal system so others could feel it vibrate through their shoes. Mason added a new leaf with the word "welcome" spoken in 24 languages, his own voice stitched quietly between each one. Harper moved more slowly that season, not from exhaustion, but from reverence. Every movement mattered. Every moment had weight. The listening room wasn't just running, it was thriving. Parents lingered in the kitchen, baking bread and trading stories, while their children moved through the halls. A grandfather from Vermont came to volunteer for a week and ended up staying 2 months after helping a boy decode his anger into sculpture. A mother who had once spent years in silence after losing a child now ran the rhythm corner, laughing louder than anyone. Ember had spread to over 70 countries. Open-source developers had added features Harper never dreamed of: languageless emotion tracking, tactile mood mapping, neural-to-light translation. She watched from afar, letting the work evolve. She answered questions when asked. She gave blessing, not direction. Her fingerprints were everywhere but invisible. One evening, just before the solstice, Nathan surprised her. He had gathered stories, hundreds, maybe more, letters from children, notes from parents, voice recordings, photos, videos, every single one from someone whose life had changed because of Ember, or the listening room, or the echo of Harper's work. He compiled them into a digital archive, simple, clean, sacred. No ads, no branding, just a single page titled, "Because You Heard Me." Harper sat for hours going through it. One video showed a non-speaking girl in Mongolia tapping 3 buttons to say, "I am here." Another, a teacher in Montana thanking Ember for helping a student identify their first panic attack. A note from a teenager in South Korea read, "I always thought I was background noise. Now I think I'm a verse." She cried, but not the way she used to. Grief had given way to awe, to witnessing, to the quiet miracle of a world she'd once tried to build alone, now standing on its own legs, speaking in thousands of voices. That night, she walked into the snow barefoot, just for a moment, just to feel it. Mason stood at the window watching her, wrapped in a blanket. Nathan followed her, with boots in one hand, a cup of tea in the other, but didn't rush. She stood there under the dark skin, arms open, flakes melting on her skin. When she came back inside, Mason said, "What were you listening for?" She answered without pause, "Nothing. I just wanted to say thank you." They celebrated the end of the year not with a party, but with a listening vigil. Children took turns playing their favorite sounds. Some shared recordings of dogs barking, others the clink of teacups, the thrum of rain against metal. One boy played the sound of a washing machine, saying it reminded him of when his mother used to sing while folding clothes. Another played his own heartbeat. Then his sister added hers. Together they created a duet. At midnight they dimmed the lights and sat in silence. It lasted for 7 minutes. No one interrupted. No one moved. When it ended, Harper said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." And it was, because silence, once feared, had become a language. And in that language there was room for everything. For grief, for love, for futures not yet imagined. Outside the snow kept falling. Inside they kept listening.